One of the deepest reasons avoidants avoid seeing you in person has nothing to do with a lack of feelings. In many cases, it is precisely because the feelings are too strong. Distance gives them control, and control for the avoidant mind feels like emotional survival. You have to understand how an avoidant experiences connection. Most people think relationships are built through closeness, communication, vulnerability. But for avoidants, closeness often activates danger signals buried deep in their nervous system. The closer someone gets, the more exposed they feel. So they learn to manage intimacy in ways that keep emotion at arm's length. Texting becomes safer than talking. Calling becomes safer than meeting. Delayed responses become a way to regulate anxiety. Ambiguity becomes protection. From a distance, they can control the pace. They can decide when to respond, how much emotion to reveal, how vulnerable to appear. They can edit themselves, curate themselves. They can disappear for a few hours or a few days and regain emotional balance without immediately confronting the consequences of disconnection. Distance allows them to stay emotionally engaged without fully surrendering control. But the moment you are physically in front of them, something changes. Presence removes the filter. A text message can be ignored. A phone call can be shortened. But eye contact, energy, silence, emotional tension in the room, those things cannot be controlled so easily. Human beings communicate far beyond words. Your posture communicates. Your calmness communicates. Even your silence communicates. And for an avoidant, that level of emotional exposure can feel overwhelming because it bypasses the intellectual defenses they normally hide behind. This is why some avoidants seem confident and emotionally detached through a screen, but become distant, nervous, inconsistent, or withdrawn in person. Physical presence activates emotional reality. Suddenly, they cannot escape what they feel by overthinking it. They cannot maintain the same illusion of emotional independence when the connection is standing directly in front of them. And here is what most people misunderstand. Avoidants are not always running from you. Many times they are running from what gets awakened inside themselves when they are with you. Because real human connection has power. When someone truly sees you, truly feels you, it challenges every emotional defense you built to survive. An avoidant may spend years constructing an identity around self-sufficiency. I don't need anyone. I'm better on my own. Feelings complicate life. But genuine presence begins to crack that identity. Not through force. Through truth. The nervous system knows when something is real. That is why avoidants often prefer relationships that remain partially unavailable, undefined, or emotionally diluted. It allows them to experience connection without fully confronting dependency, vulnerability, or emotional risk. But in-person interaction creates intensity. It creates immediacy. It confronts them with emotions they can postpone online, but cannot easily suppress face-to-face. And this is where many people make the mistake of taking avoidance personally. They assume if they cared, they would show up. But human psychology is more complicated than that. Sometimes people avoid what matters most because it threatens the emotional structure they built their entire identity around. You must realize something powerful. People do not avoid what feels meaningless. They avoid what feels emotionally consequential. If your presence creates emotional movement inside them, if your energy forces honesty, reflection, vulnerability, or self-awareness, an avoidant may instinctively retreat. Not because you are insignificant, but because the connection is becoming too real to comfortably control. And the truth is, control has always been their substitute for safety. But no relationship can ever truly thrive inside controlled distance. Real intimacy demands uncertainty. It demands emotional exposure. It demands the courage to be fully seen without guarantees. That is the paradox of the avoidant mind. They crave connection deeply, but fear the loss of control that authentic connection requires. And the moment someone's presence becomes more powerful than their defenses, avoidance begins to feel safer than love. What makes this even more complex is that avoidants are often highly skilled at suppressing emotion without even realizing they are doing it. They don't necessarily wake up in the morning consciously deciding to avoid vulnerability. For many of them, emotional suppression became an adaptation long before they ever entered adult relationships. At some point in life, they learned that needing too much, feeling too much, or depending too deeply created pain, disappointment, rejection, or loss of control. So they trained themselves to disconnect from emotion before emotion could overwhelm them. And over time, that disconnection becomes automatic. This is why avoidance can appear calm, logical, even emotionally unaffected on the surface. But underneath that composure is often an enormous amount of unprocessed emotional material that has simply been buried rather than resolved. The problem is, buried emotion does not disappear. It waits. And physical presence has a way of bringing it back to life. Because seeing you in person is not just about seeing your face. It is about confronting emotional memory. Human beings are deeply associative creatures. A certain voice, A certain look, a certain energy can instantly reactivate emotions the mind thought it had safely locked away. Neuroscience tells us that emotional memory is not only intellectual, it is physiological. The body remembers connection. The nervous system remembers attachment. And when an avoidant sees someone they genuinely bonded with, the emotional system begins responding before the conscious mind can regain control. That is why avoidants often become inconsistent around meaningful connections. One moment they seem drawn toward you, emotionally engaged, almost vulnerable. The next moment they pull away, become cold, distracted, distant, or unavailable. People interpret this as manipulation, but many times it is emotional flooding. The feelings become too loud. Seeing you in person collapses the psychological distance that allowed them to suppress those emotions. Suddenly longing resurfaces, guilt resurfaces, desire resurfaces, regret resurfaces, and perhaps most terrifying of all, vulnerability resurfaces. Now they are no longer dealing with an abstract relationship inside their mind. They are dealing with a living emotional reality standing directly in front of them. And this creates internal conflict because avoidants often live in two psychological worlds at once. One part of them deeply craves intimacy, warmth, safety, and emotional closeness. Another part associates those same experiences with danger, loss of freedom, disappointment, or emotional dependence. So the closer the connection becomes, the more those two forces collide internally. This is why many avoidants withdraw immediately after moments of deep connection, after an intimate conversation, after physical closeness, after emotional openness, after spending meaningful time together. To the other person, it feels confusing and painful because the connection felt real. And it was real. That is exactly the problem. Real emotion activates fear. You have to understand that avoidants are often not afraid of losing you. They are afraid of losing emotional control over themselves. They fear what happens when someone reaches the parts of them they have spent years trying not to feel. Because once suppressed emotions surface, they cannot easily be managed through distraction, logic, work, independence, or emotional detachment anymore. And many avoidants have never actually learned how to sit safely with intense emotional vulnerability. They learned how to escape it, numb it, rationalize it, minimize it, but not fully process it. So when they avoid seeing you, it is often an unconscious attempt to avoid reactivating emotions they do not feel equipped to handle. And here is the painful irony. The more meaningful the connection becomes, the stronger the urge to retreat can become. Not because the bond lacks importance, but because it carries emotional weight powerful enough to destabilize the defenses they rely on to function. This is why your presence can feel emotionally dangerous to someone who has spent their entire life trying to avoid emotional exposure. You become a mirror they cannot easily look away from, a reminder of needs they tried to outgrow, a feeling they cannot fully intellectualize away. And eventually, every avoidant reaches the same psychological crossroads. Either continue running from emotion or finally face the truth that suppressed feelings do not disappear simply because they are ignored. Because what is buried alive inside the human heart never truly stays silent forever. There is another reason avoidants often resist seeing you in person, and this one is deeply uncomfortable for them to confront. Your growth changes the emotional dynamic, especially when you stop chasing them. Most avoidants unconsciously expect emotional pursuit. Not because they are evil or calculating, but because the dynamic itself gives them psychological stability. As long as someone is constantly seeking reassurance, demanding attention, over-explaining feelings, or trying to win the connection back, the avoidant remains in a familiar position of control. They become the emotionally distant one, the independent one, the one with leverage. But something profound happens when you begin healing, when you stop begging for clarity, when you stop reacting emotionally to every withdrawal, when you stop trying to convince someone to choose you, when your self-worth is no longer dependent on their validation, the entire structure changes. Because now, when they see you, they are no longer encountering the emotionally dependent version of you they became psychologically accustomed to managing. They are encountering someone calmer, stronger, more grounded. Someone who no longer needs to collapse emotionally just because they pulled away. And that can be deeply destabilizing for an avoidant. Why? Because emotionally mature energy exposes emotional immaturity without saying a single word. You do not even have to criticize them. Your presence alone becomes the contrast. When someone who once reacted with anxiety now responds with peace, it silently confronts the avoidant with a reality they may have spent years avoiding. They are no longer controlling the emotional atmosphere. And human beings are always affected by contrast. Think about it. A person can justify unhealthy behavior for years when everyone around them participates in the same emotional chaos. But when one person evolves, becomes emotionally disciplined, self-aware, calm under pressure, suddenly the dysfunction becomes visible. Not because anyone pointed it out, but because truth reveals itself through comparison. This is why avoidants often feel strangely unsettled when they encounter someone who has genuinely grown beyond emotional dependency. They may not consciously understand why they feel uncomfortable, but internally something shifts. The strategies that once created distance no longer produce the same effect. Silence no longer controls you. Mixed signals no longer destabilize you. Withdrawal no longer destroys your identity. And that changes the power dynamic completely. Now, this is important to understand. Healthy emotional detachment is not about becoming cold. It is not about pretending not to care. Real growth is not emotional numbness. It is emotional stability. It is the ability to remain connected to yourself even when another person becomes inconsistent. That kind of grounded energy has tremendous psychological impact because avoidants are often highly sensitive to emotional pressure. When pressure disappears, they lose the external distraction that allowed them to avoid confronting themselves. And suddenly they are left alone with their own internal world. Your growth forces reflection. Because when you are no longer emotionally chasing, they can no longer define themselves purely through avoidance. If you are calm, centered, fulfilled, and emotionally self-respecting, then the avoidant eventually has to confront a painful possibility. Maybe the issue was never your worth. Maybe the issue was their inability to sustain intimacy without fear. And that realization can create enormous discomfort. This is why some avoidants seem more curious about you after you emotionally detach in a healthy way. Not because games work, but because emotional self-possession changes how people experience your presence. You stop radiating desperation and start radiating certainty. And certainty is confronting to people who built their emotional lives around avoidance and ambiguity. But here's the deeper philosophical truth underneath all of this. Growth changes what you tolerate, but it also changes what you reveal in others. The healed version of you becomes a mirror. And mirrors are uncomfortable for people who have spent years avoiding self-examination. So when avoidants avoid seeing you after you have grown, it is often because your presence now carries something powerful: clarity. You remind them of the emotional maturity they have not yet developed, the vulnerability they still fear, and the peace they cannot find through distance alone. Because nothing unsettles emotional avoidance more than standing face to face with someone who no longer needs your validation to recognize their own value. At the core of avoidant behavior is a conflict that most people never fully see. It is not simply a fear of relationships. It is a fear of what relationships demand psychologically, because deep connection threatens the identity they built to survive. Many avoidants have spent years constructing a self-image around independence. I handle things alone. I don't need anybody. I'm more rational than emotional, and on the surface, that identity can look strong. In a culture that glorifies self-sufficiency, emotional detachment is often mistaken for maturity. People praise the person who appears unaffected, unbothered, difficult to reach emotionally. But there is a profound difference between genuine inner strength and emotional self-protection. One comes from healing. The other comes from fear. And many avoidants learned very early that vulnerability felt unsafe. Maybe emotional needs were dismissed. Maybe closeness became associated with disappointment, pressure, criticism, unpredictability, or emotional pain. So instead of learning that intimacy could be safe, they learned that dependence was dangerous. The solution their nervous system created was simple: stay emotionally self-contained. Over time, that defense stops feeling like a coping mechanism and starts feeling like identity. This is why intimacy becomes so psychologically threatening. Because when someone gets close enough to truly see them, the avoidant is no longer just risking emotional exposure. They are risking the collapse of the very identity they built around emotional control and self-reliance. And this is where seeing you in person becomes especially difficult. Physical presence creates emotional immediacy. It softens abstraction. It humanizes connection. An avoidant can convince themselves they do not need anyone when the relationship exists at a distance. But sitting across from someone who understands them, feels them, and emotionally reaches them creates cognitive dissonance. Suddenly, the narrative of complete independence begins to crack. Because the truth is, human beings are wired for connection. No amount of intellectualizing changes biology. We are relational creatures. We regulate emotionally through connection, trust, safety, touch, understanding, and presence. But avoidants often try to override those needs through control. They attempt to become emotionally invulnerable by convincing themselves they have transcended attachment itself. But the need never disappears. It simply goes underground. And when they encounter someone who awakens genuine closeness, that hidden need rises to the surface. This creates enormous internal tension because now they are pulled between two competing realities: the desire for intimacy and the fear of dependency. To an avoidant, dependency can feel like the beginning of loss of self. That is why they may pull away precisely when the relationship starts becoming emotionally meaningful. The closer they feel, the more psychologically trapped they can become inside their own fear. Not because intimacy is inherently dangerous, but because intimacy challenges the emotional survival system they have trusted for years. And understand this carefully. Avoidants do not fear weakness as much as they fear surrender. Real intimacy requires surrender. Not surrender of dignity. Not surrender of identity. But surrender of emotional armor. The willingness to be affected by another human being. The willingness to admit, your presence matters to me. And for someone who built their entire sense of safety around emotional control, that can feel terrifying. This is why avoidants often create distance after moments of closeness. After vulnerability, after emotional honesty, after meaningful connection. Their nervous system interprets intimacy as exposure, and exposure activates self-protection. So they retreat, not always because they stopped caring, but because caring started feeling too real. And the tragedy is that many avoidants confuse emotional isolation with freedom. They think avoiding vulnerability protects them from pain, but in reality, it often disconnects them from the very experiences that make life meaningful: love, trust, emotional safety, shared growth, and authentic connection. Because no human being becomes truly powerful by feeling nothing. Real strength is the ability to remain open without losing yourself. Real confidence is the ability to love without needing control. Real freedom is the ability to connect deeply without running from vulnerability. And eventually, every avoidant faces the same existential truth. The walls built to prevent emotional pain can also prevent emotional fulfillment. Because the longer a person protects themselves from being hurt, the greater the risk they also protect themselves from being fully loved. There is another layer to this that people rarely talk about honestly, and it may be one of the most uncomfortable truths of all. Avoidants often fear accountability more than they fear conflict itself. Most people assume avoidants disappear because they want peace, because they hate drama, because they are simply overwhelmed by emotion. And sometimes that is partially true. But underneath that explanation is something deeper. Accountability requires emotional presence. It requires a person to fully witness the impact of their behavior, not intellectually, but emotionally. And that is exactly what in-person interaction forces them to confront. Distance gives avoidants psychological escape routes. Through texts, delayed replies, vague communication, emotional ambiguity, they can maintain a level of detachment from the consequences of their actions. If someone is hurt, disappointed, confused, or emotionally affected, they do not have to fully sit inside that reality. They can rationalize it, minimize it, distract themselves from it, but face-to-face interaction removes many of those defenses. Because human beings communicate truth beyond words. You can hear disappointment in silence. You can feel sadness in energy. You can see emotional exhaustion in someone's eyes. And when an avoidant sits across from someone they have emotionally impacted, something becomes unavoidable: reality. Not the story they told themselves, not the justification, not the intellectual explanation, the emotional reality. Now suddenly, they are confronted with something they may have spent months trying to avoid: the awareness that their inconsistency, withdrawal, mixed signals, or emotional unavailability affected another human being deeply. And for many avoidants, this creates intense internal discomfort because it clashes with how they want to see themselves. Most avoidants do not think of themselves as cruel people. In fact, many are highly sensitive underneath their defenses. But sensitivity without emotional courage often creates avoidance patterns that unintentionally wound others. And facing that truth requires vulnerability, humility, and emotional responsibility. That is why some avoidants prefer disappearing over having difficult conversations. Not because conversations are impossible, but because conversations create accountability. Accountability threatens the protective self-image that says, "I'm independent, rational, and unaffected." It forces a person to acknowledge that emotional distance also has emotional consequences. And this becomes especially difficult when the other person is calm. A lot of avoidants unconsciously know how to navigate emotional chaos. If someone reacts explosively, chases aggressively, or becomes emotionally reactive, the avoidant can focus on the other person's behavior instead of their own. The chaos becomes a distraction. But when someone sits calmly, speaks clearly, and simply tells the truth about how the dynamic affected them, there is nowhere to hide psychologically. Because mature honesty removes escape routes. And this is why avoidants may avoid seeing you in person after periods of inconsistency or emotional withdrawal. Deep down, they know presence creates confrontation, not necessarily confrontation through anger, but confrontation through truth. Your calmness becomes evidence. Your healing becomes evidence. Your clarity becomes evidence. And evidence is difficult to emotionally outrun. Now, this does not mean avoidants are evil manipulators incapable of change. Many of them are carrying unresolved emotional wounds they never learned how to process properly. But wounds do not erase responsibility. Trauma may explain behavior, but it does not remove the impact behavior has on others. This is one of the great psychological lessons of adulthood. Emotional maturity is not measured by how little you feel. It is measured by your willingness to take responsibility for what your feelings and fears cause you to do. And for avoidance, accountability feels dangerous because it threatens emotional exposure. To admit they hurt someone may force them to access guilt, regret, sadness, empathy, and vulnerability, the very emotions they have spent years trying to suppress. So avoidance becomes protection. But the irony is powerful. The more a person avoids accountability, the heavier the emotional weight becomes internally. What is avoided externally accumulates internally. Unspoken truth does not disappear. Emotional consequences do not vanish simply because they are ignored. Eventually, every emotionally avoidant person faces the same reality. Running from accountability may temporarily protect the ego, but it slowly damages the ability to sustain authentic human connection. Because intimacy cannot survive where honesty is consistently avoided. And at some point, every human being must decide which pain they are willing to live with. The temporary discomfort of emotional accountability or the permanent loneliness created by endlessly avoiding it. At the deepest level, beyond all the behavioral patterns, beyond the avoidance, the withdrawal, the inconsistency, there is something far more profound happening inside the avoidant psyche. And it is this: they often sense on some level that real connection could change them. Not in a superficial way, not in a new relationship, new habits kind of way, but in a structural identity level way. The kind of change that doesn't just alter behavior, but reshapes how a person relates to emotion, vulnerability, and even themselves. And that is what creates both attraction and fear at the same time. Because real connection, authentic, emotionally present, grounded connection, does not just offer companionship, it offers transformation. When someone truly sees you, not the version you perform, not the version you protect, but the version underneath all of that, something begins to shift internally. The defenses that once felt necessary start to feel less absolute. The emotional distance that once felt safe starts to feel limiting. And for an avoidant, that realization is destabilizing. They are not just dealing with another person. They are dealing with a possibility that intimacy might actually be safe. And if intimacy is safe, then everything they built their identity around, emotional self-reliance, distance, control, independence as protection, has to be reevaluated. This is why deep emotional connection can feel like standing at the edge of something unknown. Because on one side is familiarity, the known world of emotional control, detachment, and self-protection. On the other side is something far more uncertain: emotional openness, vulnerability, dependency, and surrender. And the nervous system does not interpret uncertainty as curiosity. It often interprets it as threat. So even when an avoidant feels drawn to you, even when they experience genuine emotional resonance, there is another part of them asking a silent but powerful question: what will I become if I allow this to continue? Because transformation is not abstract. It is identity disruption. To open up deeply means letting go of the version of self that never needed anyone. It means questioning beliefs that have been repeated for years. I am better alone. I am safer detached. I cannot rely on others. These beliefs are not just thoughts. They are emotional survival strategies. And survival strategies are not easily abandoned, even when they cause suffering. This is why avoidants often oscillate between closeness and distance. It is not randomness. It is internal negotiation. One part of them leans toward connection because connection feels alive, meaningful, even healing. Another part pulls back because connection feels like loss of control over the identity they have carefully maintained. And when the emotional intensity increases, so does the fear of change. Because real connection does something subtle but powerful. It makes emotional honesty unavoidable. You cannot fully hide inside intellectual defenses when someone consistently meets you with presence. You cannot indefinitely maintain emotional distance when someone's energy keeps inviting closeness without pressure. And over time, that consistency begins to soften even the most guarded emotional systems. But softening is not always experienced as relief at first. Sometimes it is experienced as threat, because softness requires letting go of control. And this is where many avoidants retreat, not because they are incapable of love, but because they are standing at the threshold of becoming someone who loves differently than they have ever known how to love before. That threshold is powerful. It is also frightening. So they step back. They create distance. They rationalize. They minimize. They convince themselves that detachment is clarity, that independence is peace, that emotional restraint is strength. But underneath those narratives is often a quieter truth they do not fully admit even to themselves. Something in that connection was real enough to change them, and that reality feels too big to hold without losing control. And yet this is the paradox they eventually face. The very thing they avoid is also the thing that could free them, because connection does not destroy identity. It expands it. It dissolves rigid self-concepts that were formed out of fear and replaces them with something more flexible, more human, more alive. But to reach that state, a person has to be willing to tolerate the discomfort of transformation. And avoidants, more than most, are learning this truth slowly. You cannot selectively numb emotional pain without also numbing emotional possibility. So when they avoid seeing you, when they pull back from what feels meaningful, when they resist the closeness that could deepen the bond, it is not simply rejection of you. It is often hesitation at the edge of who they might become if they stopped running from connection and finally allowed themselves to be changed by it. And the final truth is this: no one escapes transformation forever. They only delay the moment they realize they were never truly protecting themselves from love, only from the version of themselves love would require them to become.